In the manga covering game, if you're not first, you're last. And therefore, if you genuinely want to break down chapters for all the anticipatory readers out there trying to keep up with manga like JJK, MHA, Black Clover, Kaiju No. 8, Dawn to Dawn, you gotta be real ahead of the curve. You gotta get those chapters as soon as you can. Because much in the same way that newspapers 100 years ago were trying to be the first to get to a scoop, the level of quality of content you have to make if you're the first person to talk about something is substantially lower than if you are to talk about it not first. Which is why today we're going to be talking about chapter 113 of Kaiju No. 8, almost a full week after it came out.
Oh, Nick, why? Did you just say you have to be first to talk about it?
Yeah, I did, but only if you want your quality to be low. And so when I was reading this chapter 4 days ago when it came out, I made the conscious decision that I'm gonna chew on this chapter for a little bit, because chapter 113 of Kaiju No. 8 revealed possibly the most about the history of Kaiju No. 8 we've ever seen. See, not only are we reaching the epic conclusion of the battle between Kaiju No. 8 and Kaiju No. 9, but we also got to reveal that Isayao is still alive in Kaiju No. 9 and fighting. Which ironically, it's a very similar plotline to something that was just revealed in JJK, which was ironically a very similar plotline to something that was just revealed in MHA. Oh my god. They're storyboarding together. But on top of this, we gotta look into the past history of kaiju fighting. Some exposition on the kaiju that wiggled its way into Kafka's mouth in chapter 1. And so much more. This chapter was genuinely probably the most important chapter we've ever received in Kaiju No. 8. And I absolutely didn't just read it today. How dare you imply that? I haven't just been drinking for 3 days straight because of Labor Day weekend and just happened to open Shonen Jump today looking for things to talk about just to stumble upon an incredible chapter from Kaiju No. 8. Why would you assume that? This is days of me stewing upon a chapter to truly give you the best possible breakdown on it. Obviously. But if anybody has Tylenol, please send it. Regardless of my reasonings, today I do want to talk about chapter 113 of Kaiju No. 8. And whether that's too late for you or not, well, that's up to you. Because today we're talking chapter 113 of Kaiju No. 8. Explained. But before we get to explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you want to see me try to bring real-life challenges to the anime world, go ahead and follow the brand new channel that I just created with Stephen Heat, Chris Barnett, and Danny Mata called Anime IRL. Or if you just want to hear me talk about anime and manga, go ahead and listen to my anime podcast, Talkers Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime and manga this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So, chapter 113 picks up just where chapter 112 left off, with Kafka landing a modified Thunder Emperor directly into No. 9's core. Now, this was obviously off the back of events like Mina getting her railgun and blowing away No. 9's shield, No. 9 revealing that they had another shield around their core just for Isayao to rage inside of No. 9 and destroy that shield, Mina destroying all of the exploding body parts that No. 9 was trying to create distance between themselves and No. 8, and thus this 25-page chapter opens with the aftermath of Kafka landing that hit. And we see very clearly that No. 9's core has begun to crumble, and thus in the next page we get a reaction shot from everybody who's involved in this fight or simply just watching it, as we see Mina gritting her teeth, the child onlookers with their mouths agape, and Kaiju No. 9 spitting up blood as Kafka realizes his core is cracked. And it's at this point that Kafka thinks to himself, this is the end. However, No. 9 starts to monologue, saying, No. 8, let's have a little chat. Now, mind you, while Kaiju No. 9 is saying all of this, both of Kafka's hands are still inside of No. 9's chest. And from around those hands begins to leak tendrils of what appears to be electricity. And before Kafka knows it, he's standing in a double spread page in a far off past, surrounded by what appears to be Oni mask-clad dead samurai, and an entire battlefield of them. Now, this moment feels like a rather clear reference to the beginning of kaiju fighting in Kaiju No. 8. Now, the little that we know about kaiju fighting in Japanese history was that the first kaiju started to emerge in Japan during the Maireki period. Now, during this time in Japanese history, also known as the Edo period, many eras existed within the Edo period, and these eras are signified by whatever emperor was reigning over Japan for that period. And thus when you hear something like, oh, the Maireki era, you think with the evidence of so many other eras, it must be tens, if not hundreds of years long. But no, in actuality, the Meireki period was only 3 years in Japan, and thus the inclusion of the Meireki era in the Kaiju number 8 manga as a talking point has always been a bit of a head-scratcher, as this 3-year period was simply signified by the time that a man by the name of Gosai existed as emperor over Japan in Edo. However, Emperor Gosai Tenno's time as emperor wasn't that much fun, as only 2 years into his emperorship, the entire city of Edo burnt down, and just a couple of months after that, the Imperial Palace of Kyoto was also burnt down. However, those are the only real events of any true importance during the Meireki period, and thus once again the idea that Kaiju number 8 feels the need to include the Meireki era as a talking point in its manga will forever confuse me. But maybe it's just to give a hyper-realistic timeline of when Kaiju first invaded Japan, as that would give us a period between 1655 and 1658. Now when Kafka looks around and sees this battlefield scattered with dead samurai, he's quite fairly kind of perplexed, and he thinks to himself, what, is this a battlefield? Is this inside number 9? And as he scans around, he asks, where did he go? However, as he's scanning, his eyes fall upon an Oni mask on the ground. And when he finds his Oni mask, he thinks to himself, this mask looks familiar. Now, it's because this mask and the mask being worn by all the samurai on this battlefield he's currently standing on are identical to the mask that he saw on the samurai at Ryuni Shrine. Now, for those of you who don't remember what Ryuni Shrine is, can't necessarily say I blame you. See, it was in chapter 66 when Hoshina and Kafka were having a sparring duel to see how strong Kafka had gotten, that Hoshina took Kafka to the Ryuni Shrine, a place where one of the biggest and most important kaiju battles of all times took place. A battle where more kaiju slayers died in combat than ever before and ever since. And thus, while the Ryuni Shrine is meant to enshrine all of those who have died in combat against the kaiju, it was also the center of vicious fighting in 1657 when the majority of the Edo and Kanto regions were burnt down by the first major kaiju cataclysm. And I'm now just figuring out why they used the Meireki area. I don't know how it took me this long. They're saying that the burning of Edo was done because of the first Daikaiju. However, after Kafka and Hoshina had their sparring match at the Ryuni Shrine, Kafka saw as he bowed to the shrine and went to leave, in the mists, there was a samurai holding a giant spear. And that samurai wore an Oni mask. Now, when Kafka made eye contact with this giant samurai with an Oni mask, there was static in his brain, as though the kaiju inside of him was making some kind of inherent connection to the samurai. And the samurai appeared to be staring at him with lethal intent. However, it's been over a year since that chapter came out, and we really never got much of a breakdown on what that was. Until now, but more on that later. Because while Kafka's looking down at the Oni mask and thinking about how familiar it looks, he looks over and sees a baby chibi version of Kaiju number 9 standing beside it. And as he looks upon him, he says, number 9. But number 9 cuts him off and says, at first I thought it was a coincidence that you showed up in front of me. But I knew once I sensed the one inside of you that this was a stroke of fate from a long, long time ago. To which Kafka asks, what are you even talking about? Now, it's important to note that Kaiju number 9 appears to be the most small and childlike we've ever seen it. While Kaiju number 9 does absolutely have the ability to change their body into an amalgamation of different shapes, the Kaiju number 9 that we've always kind of seen as their base form has been that of an adult-like body. And therefore, it feels as though a parallel is being drawn between Kaiju number 9's childlike body and the era they're both currently existing in, as if to imply that Kaiju number 8 and 9 knew each other from this Meireki era, when they were both substantially younger kaiju. Kaiju number 9 adds validity to this claim when he asks, does this sight not look familiar to you? To which Kafka cuts him off by saying, like I said, I don't know what you're talking about. Kaiju number 9 cuts him off and says, so I see. You're not that deeply linked yet. Almost definitely referring to Kafka and Kaiju number 8, implying that Kafka and Kaiju number 8's relationship is still in its infantile period. That is to say that there's still substantial growth yet to come. And this surprises even Kaiju number 9, who is astonished by the fact that they were able to output so much energy when they're not deeply linked. Kaiju number 9 goes on to say, looks like your grudge from back then was intense, implying that Kaiju number 9 and Kaiju number 8 had some kind of previous beef, which I can only assume, considering the fact that it is a grudge by Kaiju number 8 held against Kaiju number 9, included Kaiju number 9 in some capacity or another betraying Kaiju number 8. Now Kafka, confused by all of this, begins to yell at Kaiju number 9, saying, what are you babbling about? All right, you're not done yet. I'll just kill you with one more hit. But to this point, the Kaiju number 9 interrupts him and says, no. You win. It won't be long before I disappear, with my hopes dashed. You and I have fought, Kafka Hibano. and you have won. I really enjoyed myself. You humans surpassed one expectation after another and thoroughly crushed my plans. Now, while he's saying all of this, we see in the background all of the events where humans surpassed their limits. Moments where Isiao and Gen and Mina all did superhuman feats to defeat the kaiju that Kaiju number 9 created. Kaiju number 9 then continues by saying, I wanted to know more. I wanted to research more. I wanted to get closer to humans. I admit defeat. Now, Kafka, livid by this sentiment, says, stop lying. But Kaiju number 9 says, I'm not lying. I'm out of options. But then Kafka says, well, if you're not lying, then what is that? What is that coming out of your body? And it's this point that we see some kind of amorphous blob with too many eyes and mouths. Weird how that's happened twice now in the last 2 weeks. Actually, in the last week, is flowing out of Kaiju number 9's body. And it's saying, killed, kill, 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 kill. And this seems to have an incredibly visceral reaction on Kaiju number 9 inside of Kafka. As we get a giant panel of Kafka standing with Kaiju number 8 booming over him with veins running up its face, very clearly enraged. And Kafka thinks to himself, why is it reacting that way? We then cut back over to Kaiju number 9, who's beginning to swell and expand. And as the swelling and expanding of Kaiju number 9 continues, we see its size become gargantuan. As it says, it appears as though my core being destroyed has upset my equilibrium. I will now be reduced to a beast that only destroys. And it's at this point that we get a flashback to Mina telling Kafka that there was countless kaiju inside of Kaiju number 9. She knows this because Kaiju number 9 absorbed her for a small amount of time, and thus Mina had to fight against these countless kaiju. Kafka then screams out, what the hell are you? But before he can get the full sentence out, the earth below him explodes. And we see as this battlefield he's standing on is reduced to smithereens, and as the Oni mask clad in samurai corpses fall around him, Kaiju number 9 starts to ask Kafka a question, saying, what did you humans used to call this again? If I recall, it was the May? That's right. And as a giant kaiju emerges from the ground, Kaiju number 9 says, the Dai Kaiju of the Meireki era. Now, this kaiju is a giant smattering of body parts that shouldn't be in the places that they are. There are multiple heads, eyes, mouths, arms in every single feasible location. And this giant kaiju is staring down at Kafka, who's standing there in front of it what almost seems like defenselessly. And as Kafka lays his eyes upon this giant Dai Kaiju, his brain wanders back to the samurai he saw at Ryuni's shrine. But right after that happens, we cut back to the real world, to the world outside of Kaiju number 9's mind, and we see a face of utter shock from Mina as it's revealed that Kaiju number 9's core, as it exploded, burst through Kafka's chest. And with that, the chapter comes to a close. Now, there's a lot to unpack here. What is Kaiju number 9 and Kaiju number 8's relationship? Why would Kaiju number 8 hold a grudge against Kaiju number 9? How does this tie back into the Ryuni Shrine and the original Dai Kaiju Cataclysm event? Were Kaiju number 8 and Kaiju number 9 friends? Were they originally the same kaiju? There are a lot of questions, and therefore, before we get to answering those questions, we should take stock of what we know. See, it seems fairly obvious that both Kaiju number 8 and Kaiju number 9 were present in the Meireki era, and that Kaiju number 8 holds a massive grudge against Kaiju number 9, which is why Kaiju number 8 and Kafka together were able to gather enough power to defeat Kaiju number 9. Now, as to where this grudge could have came from, we can't necessarily say, but we do know that Kaiju number 9's motivations have always been to learn as much about humans as possible. And whether that came from absorbing them, killing them, breaking them down, fighting them, whatever it was, for some reason, Kaiju number 9 had an obsession with humans. It's also been revealed to us that Kaiju number 9 was the Dai Kaiju from the Meireki era that destroyed the majority of Edo, or Tokyo, which would mean that Kaiju number 9 has probably always been antagonistic towards humans. They're antagonistic towards humans in the present and in the past, so it's safe to assume that their feelings have been consistent. It ties into the fact that Kaiju number 9 seemed to show a very visceral, angry, and or scared reaction to the releasing of the Dai Kaiju from the Meireki era, and it seems as though Kaiju number 8 feels specifically the biggest part of their grudge towards the Meireki era Dai Kaiju. That is Kaiju number 9. And therefore it feels as though, since Kaiju number 9 has always been openly antagonistic towards humans, that this would imply that Kaiju number 8 is kind of the opposite. That instead of being antagonistic towards humans, or maybe even curious about humans at all, Kaiju number 8 either wanted nothing to do with humans or wanted to help them. And honestly, either of these possibilities could be true. But what this chapter does reveal, pretty much certainly, is that the reveal of Kaiju number 8 and Kaiju number 9 simultaneously in what is now the present wasn't an accident. It appears as as though Kaiju number 9 came back to the surface, and therefore Kaiju number 8 probably followed them. Most likely to make sure that Kaiju number 9 couldn't do exactly what Kaiju number 9 is currently trying to do. Meaning that Kaiju number 8 probably views themselves as a keeper of Kaiju number 9 of sorts. A force meant to battle against the power of Kaiju number 9 to make sure they never wipe out humanity. And thus, in all likelihood, I would reckon that Kaiju number 8 and Kaiju number 9 were at least associates, if not friends, prior to the Meireki era. And it's a possibility, if I had to unpack the lore as far as I possibly could, that Kaiju number 9's curiosity in humanity led them to absorbing not only other kaiju, but humans, and that Kaiju number 8 didn't agree with this sentimentality. In fact, if I had to take my thesis even further, I would reckon that both Kaiju number 8 and Kaiju number 9 were fascinated by humans, but Kaiju number 9's fascination took them in a different direction than Kaiju number 8. And therefore, Kaiju number 8, who also has a fascination and love for humans, realized that they would have to take out their closest friend. And thus, that's probably where the grudge came from, and that's probably what happened during the Meireki era. And thus, the reason that Kafka feels such a spiritual connection to the samurai with the Oni mask is because that samurai with the Oni mask was probably the original wielder of Kaiju number 8's power. I mean, if we think about the symbolism of the Oni mask in Japanese culture, this would essentially be the samurai trying to channel the power of demons to battle against what they probably thought was a demon in Kaiju number 9. And thus the reason that all of the samurai were clad in with these Oni masks was most likely because they were following the direction of the samurai that Kafka sought Ryuni Shrine, the original wielder of Kaiju number 8's power. And thus this kind of answers a question that's been lingering in my mind for the entirety of my read through this manga, which is, if we're barely able to defeat Kaiju now that we have mobile railguns, how did we do it with katanas and spears? And it seems as though a relationship between kaijus and humans that allowed for symbiosis of sorts was the answer, as Kaiju number 8's power was most likely the thing that allowed for humanity to not die in the giant Daikaiju cataclysm event in the 1660s. And thus this battle between Kaiju number 9 and Kaiju number 8 is 400 years in the making. But that's interesting for more reasons than just the foreshadowing we got in chapter 66. You see, I've had a long-standing talking point on this channel that I think Kaiju number 8's manga might actually be coming to a close, as really when it comes down to it, no other antagonist has even been teased in the manga up until this point, and it seems as though Kaiju number 9 was going to be the be-all end-all of this story. And while we're used to mangas going hundreds, if not thousands of chapters, the idea of Kaiju number 8 closing at 120 chapters wasn't all that nuts. And thus I really think there's two ways to take this chapter, either as a confirmation of that point or as a way to refute it entirely. See, here's the thing. The fallout of this chapter could fall in two directions. Either Kaiju number 8 and Kaiju number 9 talking could serve as a way to give us the exposition of what happened in the Meireki era, and over the course of the battle against the Daikaiju of the Meireki era, Kafka and Kaiju number 8 are able to increase their affinity with each other and reach max power, which would allow for the fated battle between Kaiju number 8 and Kaiju number 9 to finally come to a close after 400 years, leading us to the end of this manga. Or, after defeating the Daikaiju of the Meireki era, Kaiju number 9, the tonal shift of the manga is that now Kaiju number 8 is the key point of focus. And unpacking what was behind the samurai and the Oni mask and the history of Kaiju slayers of past Japan will become the central talking point of Kaiju number 8 until eventually we find a new antagonist, who might very well be Kaiju number 8, or even the samurai. And I believe both of these directions for this manga hold an equal amount of validity and interest in my heart. Because while obviously you never want a good manga to end, a good manga knows when to end. And while what I'm saying might sound incredibly hazy and vague, ironically, all I'm trying to drive at here is that Kaiju number 8 has never had so many open doors to continue their story as they do now after the conclusion of this chapter. But at the same time, they also have a golden opportunity to bring this story to a close. However, surely based off the fact that Kaiju number 9 said that Kafka and Kaiju number 8 haven't highly linked with each other yet, makes me believe as though we haven't seen the end of this story. Unless, of course, that high level of linkage happens between Kafka, Kaiju number 8, and the Daikaiju of the Meireki era in the upcoming battle. In which case, if Kafka does achieve the maximum level of power, I can almost guarantee you Kaiju number 9 will be the last antagonist of the story. But genuinely, who's to say? The doors have never been this open, and that's really fun. But I'm curious to hear from you guys. How did you feel about this chapter? Who do you think the samurai is? Do you think Kaiju number 9 will be the last antagonist of this story? Tell me in the comments below. And to all you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now I'm gonna go lay down.